I never thought Christmas dinner would be the beginning of my revenge. It was my first Christmas without Henry, but I wasn't ready to surrender to the silence. Not yet. So I set the table. The candles were already burning when the clock struck 6. By 6:30, I started to fidget. By 7, I knew. The knock on the door made me jump. For a second, my chest lit up. Finally, I thought. But it wasn't Thomas. It wasn't Sarah. It was a delivery kid. Baseball cap, courier jacket. "Margaret Reed?" he asked, holding out a stiff envelope. I nodded without a word, closed the door slowly, still clinging to a sliver of hope. Inside the envelope was a plain white sheet, typed. No handwriting, no signature. "We've decided to spend Christmas with Sarah's family. Hope you understand. Merry Christmas. Thomas and Sarah." No phone call, no apology, just that. It wasn't a note. It was a verdict, a banishment. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from sadness, from fury. I sat alone at the head of the table, Thomas's chair empty across from me, Sarah's untouched. My hands crushed the note into a crumpled ball, and my eyes didn't cry. Not yet. They just stared, cold, detached. The house was completely silent, except for the oven beeping to say the turkey was done. I didn't move. Why would I? Later, I got up, walked to the cabinet, pulled out the locket Henry gave me on our first anniversary. Inside, a small photo of him, and a tiny note that read, "For when you can't trust anyone else." I never imagined those words would apply to our own son. I poured myself a glass of wine and carried it to Henry's study. In the corner of his desk, his pen still rested in its holder, same spot where he'd spend hours marking essays, writing letters, or reading with a cup of black tea. I sat down, the envelope still in my hand. That's when I felt something else inside it. I slid my fingers in carefully, hit a hard edge, pulled it out. A postcard. The photo showed an old southern house wrapped in oak trees. A small sign on the corner read, "Asheville, North Carolina." I flipped it over. I knew the handwriting instantly. "My love, you are always my safe harbor. Now let me be yours. Look inside the desk." I didn't move. It was like time stopped. Henry's voice, reaching me from the past, speaking right when I needed him most. He knew. He saw this coming. And something inside me, something that had been asleep since he died, woke up. My eyes hardened. I wasn't the widow who cooked dinner for no one. I wasn't the mother they could forget. That night, in silence, I made a vow in front of Henry's portrait. They're going to regret underestimating me. I didn't get up. I couldn't. I stayed there in the study chair, the wine glass still in one hand, the crumpled note in the other. The wall clock read 7:10. In the kitchen, the oven had already cooled, and the turkey was starting to dry out. Everything I had prepared, everything I had cared for, ignored. The wine tasted like nothing. Down the hallway, the Christmas tree lights blinked. I'd strung them myself, one by one, just like Henry and I used to do when Thomas was little. We always started with the star. This year, I placed it in silence. The silence hurt more than any scream. And there, in that chair, I started to cry. Not from weakness, not for pity. I cried for the death of the illusion, for the memory of Christmases filled with off-key carols and burnt cookies in the corners, because Henry always forgot the tray. I cried for the little caramel tucked under the couch cushion, the one I always found just before bed. I cried for the peppermint stick in my tea, for the knowing glances, for the absence. I reached into the desk drawer for a tissue, wiped my cheeks slowly. Then, almost like my body moved without me, I unlocked my phone. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe an excuse. Maybe a reason to believe this wasn't what it felt like. I opened the app. Instagram. Sarah's account was active. And there they were, Thomas wearing his favorite plaid shirt, Sarah leaning into him with her red sweater, her mother in the background, a golden turkey on the table. The whole scene, dressed in loud, tacky decorations that screamed, "Look how happy we are." The caption read, Christmas with the ones who really matter. Feeling blessed. Something stabbed at my chest. They hadn't just left. They hadn't just let me sit at that table like a forgotten shadow. They had replaced me, erased me, rewritten our bond as if it had never existed. My son, the same boy who learned to read, curled up in my lap, who cried every time he fell off his bike, who used to call me Mom, my hero, every time I found his missing sock. That boy now smiled with a woman he'd only known a handful of years. A woman with a frozen smile and greeting card quotes who'd convinced him I was optional. I turned off the screen, set the phone down on the desk, firm, no shake in my hand. I stared at the reflection of the tree in the window pane. The lights kept blinking, one green, one blue, one red, a soft rhythm, almost mocking. And as the silence wrapped itself around me again, I felt something inside me shift. I leaned back in the chair. The empty envelope sat on the desk. The postcard rested between my fingers. The fire in the living room still crackled faintly, but its warmth no longer reached me. My eyes scanned the map again and again, tracing the curves, the street names, the faint pencil marks. Henry had drawn it carefully. That much was clear, just like everything he did. Beside it, the key gleamed under the desk lamp. Old, heavy, not one of those modern chip and code things. It was from another time, the kind that opens doors with stories behind them. I picked up the letter again and read it through, this time with no interruptions. I lingered on every word. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means the world we built together is no longer protecting you. I don't want you to keep surviving in the middle of the selfishness of those who claim to love you. You deserve more. You've always deserved more. This place, this plan, is so you never have to ask for permission to breathe. I didn't move. How long had Henry been planning this without me noticing? How many times had he watched me silently, sensing what I couldn't admit, that our own son was drifting away, pulled by greed? And the worst part? He was right. Thomas had always been soft. He needed a push to make any real decision. And Sarah didn't just push, she dragged. She smiled while moving the pieces in her favor. She wasn't stupid. She knew exactly what to say, when to say it, and who to leave waiting. Now those two thought they could box me in. I leaned toward the drawer in the desk, the one that had stayed empty since Henry passed. I ran my knuckles across the wood, then closed it again. Not yet. Tomorrow. For now, I had to put everything away. The envelope, the postcard, the letter, the map. Nothing could be left out. I folded the paper gently, like someone preparing an offering, and tucked it inside the false bottom of my sewing box. Neither Thomas nor Sarah could sew. They wouldn't dare touch it. Upstairs, I changed out of my dress and into a flannel robe, sat on the edge of the bed. From there, I could see the street, the neighbors. Christmas lights still sparkled, bright and forced. A borrowed kind of joy, but I didn't need joy. I needed strategy. And now, I had it. I turned off the bedside lamp and lay back, the letter still in my hand. Not as someone searching for comfort, but as someone holding a weapon you can't see. A weapon written in ink, but loaded with memory. I wasn't gonna run. I wasn't gonna beg. My son had made his choice, and so had I. 3 days later, I took the map, the key, and walked out of the house without telling a soul. I left the dirty dishes in the sink, the mailbox overflowing, the Christmas lights still glowing. I wanted it to look like abandonment, not escape, because that's what they expected. A mother, shattered and grieving, locked away in her sorrow. Not a woman with a destination laid out by her late husband. The drive to Asheville was long. I didn't rush, windows sealed, heat barely on. The warm air inside the car clashed with the cold outside. Bare trees, gray fields, hills softened by fog. By the time I arrived, dusk was settling in. The sun slipped through the branches like strands of antique gold. The house appeared at the end of a gravel road, just like the postcard. White wood, wide porch, weather-worn columns standing guard like old friends. I stopped the car and stared. For a moment, I wasn't sure if I was about to walk into a memory or a trap, because Henry, even from the grave, still had the power to surprise me. I slid the key into the lock. It turned easily. The door opened on its own, like it had been waiting. Inside, the air smelled of dried lavender and old wood. I flipped the light switch. Everything was in place. Furniture covered in sheets. Floors swept clean. Linen curtains hanging in front of tall windows. In the kitchen, a note rested on the counter. Handwritten. "Welcome home, my love." Henry's handwriting. I stepped closer, my hands trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. Henry hadn't just bought this house in secret. He had prepared it, thought through every detail. The pantry was stocked. Cans, crackers, tea bags, jars of jam labeled with recent dates. Even a box of my favorite lemon cookies, with a sticky note attached, for when you stop crying and start fighting. I smiled, just for a second. But I did. Upstairs, every room was empty, waiting for me to decide what they would become. A refuge, yes, but also a headquarters, a place to think, to plan, with no eyes watching from over my shoulder. I made my way down to the study. I knew Henry would have one. And there it was, at the back of the house, facing the garden. A sturdy oak desk, bookshelves lined with history volumes, an old lamp, a Persian rug that looked just like the one we had at home, before Thomas spilled grape juice on it and I never could quite get the stain out. I touched the desk, open drawers, stationery, envelopes, a fountain pen. Everything looked ordinary until I ran my fingers along the underside of the desktop. There, a notch. I pressed. Click. A panel on the side shifted. A hidden compartment. I didn't open it. Not that night. Instead, I sank into the armchair in the study, took a long breath, rested my feet on the rug, and looked around the house. The soft glow of the lamps, the silence, gentle, not hollow. A quiet that didn't accuse, that didn't judge. Something was beginning here. I didn't know what yet, but I knew this. My son and his wife had no idea who they were dealing with. The next morning, before I even made my tea, I went straight to the study. I hadn't slept much, not from nerves but from impatience. I wasn't going to keep walking in the dark. I needed to know what Henry had really left behind in that hidden compartment. I knelt beside the desk and pressed the same notch I'd found the night before. The click was barely audible. The panel slid open smoothly. Inside, stacked with careful precision, were several folders bound in red string. No labels, no names. Just one small envelope on top, with my name handwritten across it. I opened it. Margaret, if you're reading this, it means my suspicions were right. I don't want to frighten you, but I do want to prepare you. Thomas and Sarah are a weakness that's grown quietly in the dark. Don't let them manipulate you. This financial structure is yours and yours alone. Protect it. Don't name it. Don't share it. Don't trust. Not even out of politeness. You know more than you let on. Use that. My pulse quickened, not from fear, from recognition. Each folder was filled with notarized documents, bank statements, property records, quiet transfers, all tied to a trust sealed through a law firm in Virginia, all legal, all protected. There were clear instructions, how to access the fund, how to shield it from third-party interference. Even a list of who to call if someone tried to insert themselves into it. Henry hadn't left a gift. He'd built me a shield, and just as I sat down to go through the details, calmly, thoroughly, the phone rang. The old default ringtone sliced through the quiet like a knife. I stood slowly, answered. "Hello." "Mom," Thomas's voice came through with a forced warmth he hadn't used since he needed money in college. "I've been trying to stop by the house, but it looks like you're not there." I said nothing, let the silence stretch. Sarah and I were thinking, since you're alone and everything, a nervous laugh. Maybe we could help you organize your accounts, go over some of your spending, maybe move some things into more modern investments. There it was, like a snake slithering through tall grass. He didn't ask how I was, No apology for Christmas. No mention of the dinner, the turkey, the envelope. He wasn't calling to check in. He was calling for access. "My finances are in order," I said, steady as stone. "Are you sure? We just want to help." His voice sweet and slick, like honey left out too long. I could see them in my mind, Thomas and Sarah, sitting at a laptop, ready to log in, ready to move the money, ready to take everything Henry and I had spent decades building. "Thank you for your concern, Thomas," I said, "but I don't need help." And before he could reply, I hung up. I walked to the tall window in the study and drew the curtains open. Outside, the bare winter trees swayed gently in the cold light. Henry had been right. They were going to try. But it was already too late for them, and far too early for them to imagine what I was about to do. Not even a week had passed. That Tuesday morning, I heard the doorbell while I was in the kitchen. Outside, the winter light lay over the porch like a dull gray sheet. I opened the door and found a thin man in a delivery jacket, holding a certified envelope. "Margaret Reed?" "Yes," I said, already knowing it wasn't good news. I signed, closed the door, carried the envelope to the study. I opened it on the desk, calm, methodical, the way one peels a poisoned fruit. What I read didn't break me, not in the way they hoped. A petition for legal guardianship filed with the county court, declaring that I, Margaret Ann Reed, widow, retired teacher, mother, was mentally incapacitated and unfit to manage my financial affairs. It was signed by Thomas and Sarah. I sat there for several minutes, the paper still lying open on the desk. It wasn't a shock anymore. It was confirmation. They knew. Somehow, they'd figured out there was more. Maybe the trust, maybe just enough suspicion. But they weren't waiting for an opportunity now. They were manufacturing one. They wanted my house, my accounts, my autonomy. And this time, they weren't coming with fake smiles or sugary phone calls. They were coming with lawyers. I read every line again, each word dripping with false concern. They claimed a list of so-called concerning behaviors, frequent forgetfulness, social withdrawal, unusual financial decisions. They were painting me as a shadow, a burden, but what sickened me most was the tone. Dry, clinical, as if we weren't talking about the woman who changed their diapers, who fed them on a teacher's salary while Thomas found himself. I stood up, walked down the hall to the living room. On the mantel, a framed family photo from 6 years ago. Henry, Thomas, me, and Sarah with that catalog smile. I picked it up with both hands and put it in a drawer because that's what they wanted, to erase me, not just my independence, but my identity, to tuck me away with a blanket and a pill while they enjoyed what they never built. I returned to the study, sat down with the trust documents spread like armor across the table. I remembered Henry's letter, his warning, his plan. He knew this was coming. And thanks to him, so did I. I opened the black address book I'd found with the papers. On the very first page, in Henry's handwriting, one name was underlined: Edward Langford, a retired attorney living just a few blocks away. Beneath the name, 2 words, also underlined: trusted, completely. I stood up, slipped the court petition into a folder, put the kettle on to boil, and as I waited for the whistle, one thing had become perfectly clear. They thought they were building a case to lock me away, but I was already preparing the evidence to take them to court. The next morning, after breakfast, I crossed the street with the folder tucked under my arm. Edward Langford's house sat at the end of the block. A modest, well-kept place, dark shingles, a garden trimmed with the same precision as his reputation. I'd seen him a few times since arriving in Asheville. Tall, white hair combed back, always with a book in hand, eyes sharp like a man who hadn't fully stepped out of the ring. I knocked twice. He opened the door himself. "Margaret Reed," I said, straight to the point. "Henry was my husband. He told me to trust you." He didn't need more. He motioned me in with a brisk nod, skipping the small talk. I sat at a table facing the garden, Edward sat across from me, opened the folder, and read in silence for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally looked up, his blue eyes were ice. "This isn't a legitimate concern, Margaret," he said, flicking the guardianship petition. "This is a well-dressed attempt at financial fraud, and one of the most cynical I've seen." He wasn't a man for soft words. I liked that. I handed him the trust documents next, Henry's letter, the notes on Sarah and Thomas. He reviewed them with the kind of focus that still smelled of courtroom firepower. "Your husband wasn't just careful," he said at last. "He was a visionary. And you're in a perfect position to defend what's yours, but you'll need a plan, and I'm going to help you build it." It took me a second to respond. "Why?" Edward leaned back, arms crossed. "Because what they're doing isn't just illegal, it's cowardly. And between us, Henry and I had more than a few conversations about Thomas. He was already showing signs, but it was Sarah who dragged him into the mud." He paused, weighing how much to tell me. "A few months ago, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that their business, that little creative gallery they opened downtown, is sinking fast. Bad decisions, personal loans, a significant debt with the bank, and now, suddenly, they want to manage your finances." I leaned back, letting it settle in. "What I suspected," I said. "It's not concern, it's desperation." Edward nodded. "And that makes them dangerous, but also sloppy." He stood, walked to a bookshelf, pulled down a black notebook and a pen, set them on the table between us. "First, we build your defense. Then we expose their true motives. But it takes time. These battles aren't won by yelling. They're won quietly, with proof, and with grace." I stood, reached out my hand. "Then let's begin." Edward shook my hand firmly. "You'll need patience, Margaret, but they will need a damn good lawyer." I finished, and for the first time, he smiled. That same afternoon, while Edward was reviewing the legal documents for our defense, I turned to the next step. Inside one of the envelopes Henry had left, among the underlined names, was that of a woman, Linda Morgan, financial consultant, an old colleague of his from back when he managed endowments for the university. Next to her name, a phone number in blue ink. I dialed from the landline in the study. She picked up quickly. "Mrs. Reed?" she asked as soon as I said my name. Her voice was firm, professional. "Yes, I'm Margaret. My husband, Henry, left me your contact. He asked me to reach out to you if things got complicated." There was a pause. "They tried to take control from you," she said, her voice low but not surprised. A chill ran down my spine. "Yes, that's exactly what they did." Linda sighed on the other end. "Then it's time. Give me 20 minutes. I'll call you back on video. I need to show you something." I hung up, went to the kitchen, poured a cup of chamomile tea, sat down in front of the laptop Henry had left charging on the desk. Even that hadn't been a coincidence. When the video call came in, I recognized her from the framed photo in Henry's office. Short hair, thin glasses, eyes like someone who's survived many corporate battles. "Thank you for taking the call," I said as she shared her screen. "Your husband was a brilliant man," she began. "But more than that, he was a strategist. For the last 6 years, we worked together on a very specific project, a discreet trust, fully protected. So complex, even I needed weeks to understand it." She opened a digital folder. Page after page flashed by dates, seals, signatures, flowcharts, staged payouts, contracts with trust firms in 3 different states. "All of this," she continued, "is in your name, Margaret. Only you have access. But there's more. Henry also created a contingency fund, liquid assets, set aside specifically for legal defense in case of a challenge from family." I didn't speak. She didn't need me to. He knew, not exactly when, but he knew how. He suspected Thomas and Sarah would move this way. We discussed it many times. He told me not to underestimate him, even after death. I pictured Henry sitting by the window with his coffee at sunset, quiet, reflective, always watching. It wasn't suspicion. It was wisdom. Linda pointed to another document. This contract authorizes me to support you however needed. Account access, reporting, movement history. If the court requires evidence of your competency, we'll have it. If Thomas tries to touch a single cent from this trust, the system is set to notify me immediately. And if they try to sell properties, they can't. They have no power of attorney. They're not even mentioned in the filings. Not his name, not hers. They're legally irrelevant. I smiled. Not from joy, from justice. Linda adjusted her glasses. Mrs. Reed, you're not alone. You have more weapons than you think, and a man who loved you enough to protect you, even beyond the grave. It's not protection, Linda, I corrected her. It's power. And Thomas was about to learn that. The hard way. The next morning, I returned to Edward's house with a notebook under my arm. I'd filled it during the night, page after page. Dates, names, expenses, routines. Anything that could prove I was sharper than ever. Because I was. He was already waiting, coffee brewed, a stack of freshly printed folders laid out in front of him. We're going to dismantle their claims from the inside, he said, eyes still on the documents, point by point. For hours, we worked in silence. It felt like we'd been doing this together for years. He built the defense strategy. I reviewed every page with the same precision I once used grading university theses. Photocopies of my monthly payments, bank statements, medical appointments, letters, recent photos, my participation in the Asheville Book Club, articles I'd published in the county's historical journal. Every detail, every small trace of my independent life was another brick in the wall I was building. Then came the moment. I reached into my bag and pulled out the blue envelope. Inside was my will. A new one, signed that same week in front of a notary. Witnessed, legal, ironclad. Edward read it, raised an eyebrow. Are you sure? More than ever, I replied, without hesitation, because this wasn't just about defending myself anymore. It was about making sure they'd never again find an open door into my life. In that document, every property, every fund, every valuable asset was left directly to a children's literacy foundation Henry and I had supported for decades. His name was right there at the top of the page, a quiet signal. We were still making decisions together. This is going to sting, Edward said. Good, I answered, because they didn't deserve pain. They deserved irrelevance, the kind of punishment you don't shout, you sign. The rest of the week played out like a cold, deliberate choreography. Calls to witnesses, evidence collection, strategy meetings with Linda over video. No one cried. No one wavered, just calculated, precise steps. One afternoon, while Edward sorted documents into boxes, he offered me a glass of wine. I declined. When I win, I said, I'll toast, not before. He watched me for a moment, measuring the steel in my voice. Thomas has no idea what he started, he muttered. But I did. And when that courtroom door opened, he would learn too. The trial began on a Monday, 9 a.m. sharp. The courtroom was small, wooden benches, high windows, and a pale, sterile light that poured in like a scalpel. I sat beside Edward at the defense table, wearing a charcoal gray suit that reminded me of my old days in the classroom. Straight-backed, dignified, not a single wrinkle out of place. Across from us, there they were. Thomas, in his expensive suit, wearing that same guilty look I used to see when he lied as a boy. Sarah, polished as ever, her face fixed in a perfect mask of false concern. And their lawyer, a young man confident, with the smugness of someone who believes a 72-year-old widow poses no threat. They began painting their version of me, a fragile old woman, grieving, isolated, emotionally unstable. Every word was cruelty wrapped in sympathy. Mrs. Reed has shown patterns of erratic behavior, Thomas's lawyer claimed. Extended isolation, unfounded suspicion, impulsive financial decisions. We simply want to ensure she's protected. I turned my head just enough to see Sarah's satisfied smirk. She thought this was a formality, a trap already sprung. But then it was Edward's turn. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't grandstand. He simply laid out, one by one, every document we'd prepared. Here are her regular bill payments. Here, her recent academic publications, photographs of her community involvement. And here, he said, lifting a sealed envelope, a notarized will signed with full mental capacity. The judge nodded, jotting notes. Then Edward called Linda Morgan. She entered like she was walking into marble halls, composed, elegant, unshakable. Under oath, she testified to working with Henry for over 6 years. She detailed the creation of the trust, presented emails, contracts, and the emergency legal fund. Henry Reed anticipated this scenario. She said, he put every measure in place to protect his wife, not out of fear, out of foresight. The silence in the courtroom thickened. But Edward wasn't done. Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to call one final witness. Heads turned. The mailman. An older man still in uniform, holding a worn folder. He spoke calmly, explained how he delivered mail to my home daily, how he saw me gather it, greet neighbors, read the paper on my porch. Have you ever noticed anything that might suggest mental decline or impairment? Not a thing, he said plainly. Mrs. Reed is sharper than I am. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the benches. Even the judge allowed the faintest smile. But Sarah wasn't smiling anymore. Thomas gripped the edge of the table so tightly, his knuckles had gone white. And me? I hadn't said a single word, but every eye in that room knew exactly who was in control. The judge nodded. Edward gave me a calm look. Margaret, he said, it's your turn. I stood with ease, adjusted my jacket, and walked to the witness stand. Each step was its own statement. No shaking. No hesitation. I sat up straight, folded my hands in my lap, and looked at my son's lawyer, the way you'd look at a mediocre student trying to pass off plagiarism. He spoke first. Mrs. Reed, he said with a measured tone, can you tell us what medications you're currently taking? Vitamin D, calcium, and 1 baby aspirin every night, I replied. I can provide exact dosages if you'd like. His brow twitched. And your daily routine? Could you walk us through it? I smiled, just a little. I wanted that question. Of course. I wake up at 6:30, walk for 40 minutes. Then breakfast. 1 slice of whole grain toast with homemade jam, half a cup of oatmeal, chamomile tea. After that, I read the local newspapers, the Asheville Tribune and the Chronicle, then spend 3 hours reviewing historical archives. I work from home, with remote access to county records. And after that, he pushed. After that, I eat lunch. Today it was lentil soup. Then I came to court to respond to an absurd accusation of mental incompetence filed by my own son. Would you like more details? Silence. Only the soft click of the court stenographer's keyboard. He shifted tactics. Can you tell us how much is in your primary bank account? $82,441.19 as of last Friday's close. In my secondary account, $14,203. Credit card has a $322 positive balance. All expenses are automated. The breakdown is in this folder, I said, sliding it toward Edward. I didn't look at Thomas or Sarah. My eyes stayed on the attorney, like I was slicing through meat with a scalpel. And your hobbies? Your social life? I run a book club on Thursdays, and I host local history lectures on Mondays at the library. The last topic was railroad cartography in North Carolina, 1900 to 1935. Mr. Jameson from the mayor's office attended. He's available to testify if you need. The lawyer took a step back. He wasn't looking for answers anymore. He was looking for oxygen. Do you believe you need permanent legal assistance or guardianship? I leaned slightly toward the mic. No, what I need is respect and justice, and I'm making sure I get both. The judge stared at me for a few long seconds, then nodded and motioned for me to step down. As I walked back to my seat, I passed Thomas. He didn't look at me. Neither did Sarah, but their faces said everything. The fragile mother they imagined had just erased their last excuse. The judge called for a short recess before the next witness. The courtroom exhaled, but it was just surface. You could feel it in the air. that charge of something about to snap. Edward didn't stand. He just leaned slightly toward me and whispered, "Get ready." Minutes later, Thomas was called to the stand. He walked like a man, trying to look confident, but carrying a backpack full of bricks. He swore to tell the truth. His attorney looked at him like he expected a solid performance. Poor fools. Edward got right to it. "Mr. Reed, were you aware of the trust your father created for your mother?" Thomas blinked. "No, I had no idea," he said, feigning surprise. "Are you certain?" "Absolutely." Edward didn't even look at him. He flipped slowly through his folder, deliberately calm. "Then can you explain this?" He held up a document. The bailiff handed it to the judge. Then it flashed on the courtroom screen. An email. From Sarah Reed to a local real estate agent. Subject: urgent, property valuation. And right there, in the message body, "We need a full appraisal of the house as soon as we can get Margaret's things out. Transfer should be ready once we gain legal control. Confidential." The courtroom froze. Sarah covered her mouth. Thomas turned ghost white, like someone had siphoned the blood from his body. The judge slid his glasses down his nose and looked at Thomas. "Would you like to revise your answer, Mr. Reed?" Thomas stammered. No full sentence came out, just a sputtering mess. Edward didn't flinch. "Your Honor, this evidence shows premeditation, deceit, and a clear intent to exploit a mentally capable woman under false legal claims." Sarah's lawyer tried to interrupt. The judge raised a hand. No further comments. Then the gavel. Petition for guardianship. Denied. The echo of the judge's gavel still hung in the air when the murmurs began. No one even tried to whisper. Every pair of eyes in that courtroom turned toward Thomas and Sarah. And there they stood, like broken statues. The smiles wiped clean. The veneer of fake concern cracked wide open, exposing nothing but raw greed underneath. The judge didn't even let them speak. In addition to denying guardianship, he said, "This court orders the petitioners to cover all legal fees incurred by Mrs. Reed. The abuse of the judicial system for personal gain is unacceptable." Sarah gasped. Thomas clenched his fists, his knuckles as white as chalk. Edward, beside me, just gave a quiet nod. No need to celebrate. We'd already won more than just a legal case. The courtroom began to empty. As I walked toward the doors, I felt the eyes on me. Not out of pity, something else. Something I hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Respect. As I passed Thomas, I stopped. For a second, he thought I'd speak. That I'd offer a word, a sign, a crack of reconciliation. But no, I just looked at him, cold, still, unshaken. Then I walked away. Edward was waiting outside with 2 coffees in hand. We strolled down the courthouse steps in silence until we found a bench nearby. I sat down, exhaling like someone who'd finally removed a weight from her chest. "So what now?" he asked, handing me the cup. I held it between my palms, warm, steadying. "Now I can finally grieve," I said, "not for Thomas, for Henry, because all that time I hadn't really let myself mourn him. His absence had been buried under betrayal, fear, and fury. But now the truth had stood tall. What he built with love and foresight had held. "I've never admired anyone more," Edward said, glancing at me. "Do you know what you did today, Margaret? You showed that courtroom what dignity looks like." I didn't answer. I just sipped the coffee, closed my eyes. Yes, I'd lost a son. But not because of anything I did. He chose greed, and greed always comes at a price. Now I had what Henry left me, not just a house, not just a plan, something far greater, freedom, peace, and something even rarer at my age, a second chance. If this story struck a chord with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Have you ever faced a betrayal like this? Tap that like button if it kept you on the edge of your seat, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories just like this one. Thank you for being here with me and for never letting women like us be silenced.